August 15th, 1944. The Pacific stretched endless and gray. A transport ship cut through choppy waters carrying Japanese women and children who had been evacuated from China. Their thin clothes clung to them as salt spray hit the deck. They whispered prayers, clutching paper cranes. These women had been told Americans were monsters who tortured prisoners and starved captives. Yet when the camp gates opened, guards handed them cafeteria trays with hamburgers, ice-cold Coca-Cola in glass bottles, white bread, and peanut butter. One woman, stared at her plate in disbelief. Another guard approached with a sewing kit so she could mend her torn kimono. They had been prepared for beatings, for starvation, for death. Instead, they found themselves called Mrs. and Miss. But how could the enemy show such kindness? These Japanese women couldn't believe hamburgers and Coca-Cola in American prison camps were real. If you want to hear more incredible untold stories from history that will completely change how you see the world, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how these stories reach people everywhere around the world. The morning sun filtered through the chain-link fence as a Tanaka knelt beside a patch of dark earth, her fingers working carefully around the tender shoots of lettuce. The camp garden stretched before her in neat rows, a sight that still amazed her after 3 weeks of internment. Back in Tokyo, she had taught children about American barbarism from textbooks filled with propaganda images. Yet here she weighs, tending vegetables alongside other Japanese women while guards walked the perimeter with quiet professionalism, rather than the cruel swagger she had expected. Mrs. Tanaka called. Sergeant O'Connor from the gate, using the title that still caught her off guard each time she heard it. He approached with that careful politeness that seemed to come naturally to him, carrying a wooden crate. Thought you ladies might like these for the garden. Inside were small hand tools, their metal surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. Kiko Matsuda looked up from where she had been weeding nearby, her dark eyes narrowing with familiar suspicion. "Why do you give us these things?" she asked in halting English, her voice carrying the sharp edge that made other women W's. But O'Connor simply nodded, as if her directness was perfectly reasonable. "Garden grows better with proper tools." "Ma'am," he replied, setting the crate down carefully. "My mother always said, you can't expect much from a plant if you don't give it what it needs." Later, as the women worked with their new tools, the conversation turned to the previous evening's dinner. Midori Sato had saved half her portion of white bread for her 2 young sons, wrapping it carefully in a handkerchief. Despite their protests that they were full, the abundance still felt impossible to believe. In Shanghai, during those final desperate months before evacuation, a single slice of bread had been a treasure worth fighting over. "The peanut butter," whispered one of the older women, a clerk named Fumo who had worked in a government office before the war. "It tastes like sweetness and salt together. I have never eaten such a thing." You found herself thinking of her daughter Mara left behind with her grandmother in Kyoto. In her letters home, carefully censored by camp officials, she had tried to describe the food without sounding treasonous. How could she explain that their captors fed them meat every day, that there was milk for the children, real milk that hadn't been watered down or stretched with rice powder? The words felt dangerous even in her thoughts. That afternoon brought English lessons in the camp's makeshift classroom. O'Connor had procured actual chalkboards from somewhere along with boxes of white chalk that the women used with reverent care. You stood before Asmal group teaching phrases that might help them communicate with the guards and camp staff. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was teaching the language of the enemy, yet the women absorbed each lesson with quiet intensity. Please and thank you came easily enough. But when she taught them I am grateful, several women struggled with the concept. Grateful to their captors, Thaddeus seemed to turn their understanding of the world upside down. Ko raised her hand, speaking in rapid Japanese. "Aya-san, is it wrong to feel not hatred when they treat us as if we are human beings?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke around them. Other women stopped their quiet conversations, waiting for an answer that none of them possessed. They had been taught to expect torture, starvation, humiliation. Instead, they received portions that filled their bowls. Medical care when the children fell ill, and guards who stepped aside respectfully when they passed in the corridors. As evening approached and the women prepared small notes of thanks to send with the guards, you found herself writing carefully in both Japanese and English. The words felt like a bridge between worlds she'd never imagined could coexist. On one side lay everything she had been taught about American cruelty. On the other stretched this bewildering reality of hamburgers served on real plates, Coca-Cola that fizzed cold against her lips, and men who called her Mrs. as if her dignity mattered. She folded the note with hands that no longer trembled quite as much as they had on that first day. Perhaps, she thought, the most dangerous thing about this place wasn't the guards or the fences. Perhaps it was shop itself, growing quietly in the fertile ground of unexpected mercy. The 4th of July arrived with a heat that shimmered off the camp's concrete pathways. But inside the mess hall, red, white, and blue bunting had transformed the utilitarian space into something almost festive. You stood with the other women near the serving line, watching camp staff arrange long tables laden with food that seemed to belong in a dream rather than a prisoner of war facility. "Is this real?" whispered Fumiko, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of hamburgers stacked on platters, their sesame seed buns golden under the fluorescent lights. Beside them sat bowls of potato salad, corn on the cob glistening with butter, and rows of Coca-Cola bottles sweating in metal tubs filled with ice. Ko translated quietly for those whose English remained limited, her voice carrying a note of wonder she tried to suppress. "They say it's their Independence Day, a celebration." She paused, struggling with the concept. "They want us to join them." The invitation felt surreal. Midori clutched her sons closer to her sides, their small faces tilted upward in curiosity rather than fear. The younger boy, Hiroshi, had grown bold enough over the past weeks to smile at some of the guards, though he still pressed against his mother's leg when they approached. Sergeant Akinor appeared beside their group, his usual quiet courtesy softened by something that might have been genuine warmth. "Ladies, please help yourselves. There's plenty for everyone." He gestured toward the ladentables with the same careful respect he showed during their daily interactions, as if they were guests at his family's dinner table rather than enemy National Sunder Guard. The first bite of hamburger sent a shock of flavor through Ya's senses. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, nestled between bread so soft it seemed to dissolve on her tongue. She had eaten beef perhaps 3 times in her life before the war, and never anything like this. Around her, other women took tentative bites, their expressions shifting from weariness to amazement. But it was the Coca-Cola that truly undid them. The first sip brought gasps of surprise at the sharp sweetness, the way the bubbles danced across their tongues. Ko actually laughed, a sound expected that several guards turned to look with smiles rather than suspicion. "It tastes like happiness," she said in Japanese, then attempted the phrase in English for Akinor's benefit. "Tastes like joy." He nodded, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "That's about right, ma'am." As the afternoon wore on, inhibitions began to dissolve like sugar in warm tea. The camp's small band played folk songs that some of the women recognized from radio broadcasts they had heard before the war. When the musicians began, "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain," Ko found herself humming along, then quietly translating the words into Japanese for the others. The moment that would stay with Ya forever came when young Hiroshi approached one of the guards, a freckled boy who couldn't have been much older than 20. With the fearless curiosity of childhood, Hiroshi pointed to the guard's uniform buttons and said something in rapid Japanese. The guard looked confused until Ko intervened. "Asks if they are gold," she translated. The young soldier knelt down to Hiroshi's level, unpinning one of the brass buttons from his sleeve. He pressed it into the boy's small palm with a gentleness that made Midori's eyes fill with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Tell him it's not gold, but it's his to keep," the guard said. That evening, as the women returned to their barracks, they carried more than full stomachs. They carried the impossible weight of joy they hadn't expected to feel again. You found herself humming one of the American folk songs, the melody weaving through her thoughts like a thread connecting 2 worlds she'd believed were separated by an unbridgeable chasm. In her cramped quarters, she opened the small notebook that had become her lifeline and began to write. "My dearest Morrow," she began, Today I tasted America, and it was nothing like the bitter poison we were promised it would be. She paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. How could she explain to her daughter that their enemies had shown them more kindness in 2 months than they had received from their own government in the final year of war? Outside her window, the last strains of harmonica music drifted across the camp, carrying with it the revolutionary idea that perhaps mercy could bloom in the most unexpected places. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, carried by a camp administrator whose face bore the weight of words too heavy for ordinary conversation. Ya was teaching her English class when the man appeared in the doorway, his clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. The women fell silent, reading in his expression what their limited English could not yet comprehend. "Ladies," he began, then stopped, clearing his throat. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ko stood slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Surrendered," she repeated in English, then switched to rapid Japanese. "Nihon ga maketa no. Japan has lost." But it was the second piece of news that shattered them completely. 2 cities had been destroyed by weapons beyond imagination: Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The names fell from the administrator's lips like stones into still water, sending ripples of horror through the assembled women. Some had families in those places. Others knew, people who might have been visiting, working, living in the paths of destruction. Fumiko collapsed into her chair, her notebook sliding to the floor with pages scattered like fallen leaves. Her sister lived in Hiroshima, worked at a textile factory near the city center. The mathematical precision of her grief was terrible to witness as she calculated distances, shift schedules. The likelihood that anyone she loved still drew breath. In the days that followed, the camp took on the quality of a funeral hall. Women who had been learning to laugh again retreated into silence. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had once seemed like gifts now felt like mockery. How could they have allowed themselves to find joy while their homeland burned? Ya found herself unable to write in her diary, the pages blank as her thoughts turned to ash. Had her acceptance of American kindness been a betrayal of everyone who had suffered? The questions circled like vultures in her mind. Each act of mercy from the guards now seemed tainted with the knowledge of what American hands had also wrought. Midori's younger son Hiroshi still clutched the brass button the guard had given him, but now he hid it beneath his pillow as if it carried some shameful secret. His mother watched him with hollow eyes, her protective instincts warring with a grief too vast for comprehension. How do you explain to a child that the same nation that fed him ice cream had turned 2 cities into shadows and smoke? The arguments began on the 3rd day after the news. Sharp whispers in the mess hall, accusations that cut deeper than any physical wound. Some women blamed themselves for accepting the comfort, for allowing their hatred to soften. Others defended the guards who had shown them dignity, insisting that kindness and destruction could somehow coexist in the same nation, the same war, the same human heart. Ko stopped translating folk songs. Instead, she sat by the fence, staring through the chain links toward a horizon that held only uncertainty. When O'Connor approached with his usual quiet courtesy, she turned away without acknowledging his presence. The bridge of understanding they had built with careful words and small gestures seemed to crumble beneath the weight of nuclear fire. On a Thursday evening, Ya sat in her quarters with her diary open before her, a blank page mocking her inability to make sense of the contradictions that had become her life. How could the same people who had called her Mrs. and given her chalk for teaching also possess the power to erase entire cities? How could mercy and destruction spring from the same source? She picked up her pencil, then set it down again. Outside her window, she could hear Sergeant O'Connor making his evening rounds, his footsteps as measured and respectful as ever. But now those sounds carried a different weight, a reminder that kindness and catastrophe could wear the same uniform, speak the same language, salute the same flag. The notebook remained empty as darkness settled over the camp, and with it came the terrible understanding that some truths were too complex for simple words, too vast for the small comfort of written testimony. The war was over, but the reckoning with what it meant to find humanity in unexpected places had only just begun. The silence stretched through the camp like fog, thick and impenetrable. For 5 days, A had refused all food except water and rice, her body rejecting what felt like participation in a celebration of destruction. Around her, other women moved like ghosts through their daily routines, their faces carrying the weight of questions that had no answers. It was Nurse Rebecca who broke through first, appearing at Yea's bedside on a gray morning when the August heat had finally broken. The American woman was perhaps 40, with graying hair pinned back severely and eyes that had seen enough suffering to recognize it in others. She carried with her a simple brown notebook, its cover worn smooth by handling. "Mrs. Tanaka," she said quietly, settling into the chair beside a cot. "I know you've been writing before all this." She gestured vaguely toward the window, encompassing the weight of atomic bombs and surrendered nations in a single movement. "My grandmother kept aviary through the influenza pandemic. Said it was the only way she could make sense of living through something that made no sense." You turned her head away, but Nurse Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the steady authority of someone accustomed to healing. "She wrote about neighbors who died and neighbors who brought soup. About doctors who saved lives and undertakers who raised their prices. About human beings being human beings, which means they're capable of everything all at once." The notebook lay between them like a bridge neither woman was quite ready to cross. "Your daughter needs to know her mother survived," Rebecca said finally. "She needs to know what survival looked like. Not just the big history, but the small moments, the truth of it." That afternoon, Ya found herself holding the new notebook, its blank pages, both terrifying and hopeful. She began not with grand proclamations or political analysis, but with the memory of Hiroshi's face when he tasted ice cream for the first time. The wonder in his eyes had been pure, untainted by the knowledge of what would come later. That moment had been real, regardless of what atomic fire had followed. Slowly, other women began to merge from their cocoons of grief. Ka started humming again. Not the American folk songs, but traditional Japanese melodies that seemed to anchor her to something deeper than politics or nationality. When one of the younger guards asked about the meaning of a song, she translated not with her previous suspicion, but with the weary patience of someone who had learned that understanding required effort from both sides. Midori allowed her sons to play with the other children again, though she watched them with fierce protectiveness. When Hiroshi showed his brass button to a new friend, she didn't take it away. Instead, she helped him polish it until it gleamed like a small sun in his palm. Kindness received is still kindness, she told her one evening, even if the hands that gave it also did terrible things. The preparations for repatriation began in early September. A slow process of paperwork and medical examinations that would return them to a Japan none of them could fully imagine. As Ya packed her few possessions, she wrapped the notebook carefully in a clean handkerchief. Its pages now held fragments of truth too precious to lose. The taste of hamburgers, the sound of children's laughter, the sight of guards who had chosen restraint over cruelty, even when their nation had chosen devastation over surrender. On their final evening, Sergeant Okanor appeared at the women's barracks with a small cardboard box. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, were glass Coca-Cola bottles, their contents still cold from the ice house. "Thought you might want to remember," he said simply, distributing them with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout their internment. He accepted hers with hands that shook only slightly. The bottle felt solid and real, a tangible reminder that complexity could coexist with compassion, that human beings contained multitudes too vast for simple judgments. She would carry it home tomorrow along with the notebook and the impossible story it contained. As Thiessen set over the camp for the last time, painting the sky in shades of amber andros, Ya opened her diary to a fresh page. "Today I learned," she wrote, "that the heart large enough to hold love is also large enough to hold contradiction, and that perhaps this is what it means to be fully human." The ship that would carry them home cut through Pacific waters that reflected a sky the color of old pewter. Ya stood at the rail with her small bundle of possessions, the Coca-Cola bottle wrapped carefully beside her diary, both treasures that seemed to belong to a different lifetime despite being only days old. Around her, the other women gathered in small clusters, their voices carrying the tentative quality of people learning to hope again. The Japan they were returning to existed only in fragments of letters and rumors passed between Red Cross officials. Cities flattened, families scattered, an entire nation bent beneath the weight of surrender and occupation. Ko had received word that her parents in Tokyo survived, but their neighborhood was gone, replaced by rubble and temporary shelters. Midori clutched her sons closer, knowing that the grandmother who had promised to care for them had died during the final bombing raids. Yet, as the coastline of their homeland appeared on the horizon, you felt something unexpected rising in her chest alongside the grief and uncertainty. Not joy exactly, but a quiet determination born from months of discovering that survival could take forms she had never imagined. The notebook in her bundle contained more than memories of hamburgers and kind guards. It held proof that mercy could bloom in the darkest soil, that dignity could be re the scars of war like old wounds beginning to heal. Rice fields had been replanted where bombing had not made the soil unusable. Children played in the ruins of buildings, their laughter a defiant assertion of life's persistence. When the train stopped at small stations, you caught glimpses of American soldiers directing reconstruction efforts alongside Japanese workers, their interactions marked by the same careful courtesy she had witnessed in the camp. Her daughter Mariko was waiting at Kyoto Station, taller than Ya remembered, and wearing clothes that had clearly been mended multiple times. But her eyes held the same bright intelligence that had always made Ya's heart swell with pride. When they embraced, Ya felt the months of separation collapse into a moment of pure reconnection. "Okanasai!" Marao whispered against her mother's shoulder. "Welcome home." That evening, in the small room they now shared with Ya's mother-in-law, Ya unpacked her bundle while Mariko watched with fascination. The sewing kit that Sergeant Akinor had provided drew admiring comments from the older woman, who pronounced the quality of the thread superior to anything available in wartime Japan. But it was the diary that commanded Maro's complete attention. "You wrote all of this in the camp?" Maro asked, turning the pages with reverent care. "Every day toward the end," Ya replied. "I wanted you to know what really happened. Not the stories others might tell, but the truth of it. The whole truth." As Maro read, her expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and finally a kind of wondering understanding. Here were hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Yes, but also the guards who had called her mother Mrs., when her own government had reduced her to a number. Here was the complexity of finding grace in captivity while cities burned, of accepting kindness from those whose nation had brought unimaginable destruction. Years later, when Maro had children of her own, she would read them selected passages from their grandmother's diary. Not to forgive or forget the horrors of war, but to remember that even in humanity's darkest chapters, individual souls could choose mercy over hatred, dignity over revenge, hope over despair. The Coca-Cola bottle, long empty but carefully preserved, would sit on their shelf as a testament to the possibility that enemies could become sources of unexpected grace, and that the heart capable of surviving war was also capable of embracing peace.